least some people online. First, I want to thank Tyrus for joining us. Professor Tyrus Miller is Dean of Humanities at University of California, Irvine. He is main domains of research related to art history in the 20th century, Avant-Garde movements, but also later art in Central Europe. He collaborates also with the International Council for Philosophy and Human Sciences, and there's a chair at his college which engages several colleagues working on Asian humanities and connections between East and West and these sort of issues. And in the framework of the Amigo program, which some of you already have been involved or will be involved in different countries, we are starting a collaboration with UCI that we will see what we can do together. I'm certainly very happy that you could find the time to come over. And we will have these two talks, which I think will feed very importantly your reflections, particularly those working in the PhD programs. Although no one here is working specifically in art history, but you will see that both on the sense of art assessment and also the philosophical reflections that are related to that, this is particularly relevant for several of ongoing researches here. And in general, in research, we always get new ideas through our neighbors dealing with something else. So thank you very much, Tyrus. The floor is yours.
And thank you. I want to thank Luis and everybody who has given me a very warm reception here. I am definitely not working in archaeology or rock art or some of the fields that I've seen represented here. But I'm learning a lot actually from the time that I'm spending here. And I did want to say about the two papers that I'm giving, both of them are reflections on something like the problems of writing a history in relation to material that doesn't necessarily line up in the kinds of chronological periodizing concepts that we often bring to historical studies. So on the one hand, today, the avant-garde and the kind of the intentionally disruptive use of these materials in a way that I want to suggest is a kind of reflection on that historical problem. And then tomorrow, I'll be talking about the cultural historian and philosopher Walter Benjamin, who wrote a history of 19th century Paris, but with a very visionary, very challenging historiographic frame of that work. So both of them in some ways deal with this, and I see some of the issues about taking the material strata and the material artifacts and putting them together into narratives that may actually challenge some of the received ideas about history or about culture through these temporal and historical parameters. So I don't want to force that connection too much, but I did want to try to say that some of the reflections that I'm seeing are in my very 20th century, 21st century work also I think have a larger framework for this, for these kinds of problems of history. And I will also say, just with respect to the question of prehistory, that was a very important impetus actually for the avant-garde, was this idea that there was a much vaster history than the history that they were immediately responding to, which was really the immediate past of the 19th century, and the possibility of grappling with different ways of thinking about history was really part of that, if you will, I mean, what some scholars have called the invention of prehistory as a late 19th century and 20th century phenomenon. So I hope that maybe motivates some of the strange things that I'll be talking about with respect to the avant-garde. Last thing I'll say is actually in the first part of this, I'll be talking about an artist that was very much involved with the new technologies of recording and reproduction, and the ways in which those might actually affect a view of these historical questions. And I think that's a phenomenon that we today are grappling with in a highly digitalized and even artificial intelligence space, where the new technologies and our relationship to history is changing because of those technological advances. So with that, I'll launch into my lecture. So I'm going to be talking about two cases in the European avant-garde in which we can observe an active unsettling and reconstruction of specific artistic and cultural traditions, but also, as I've already indicated, a more radical exploration of the very structural conditions of tradition. So the idea of a kind of historical temporality that allows a tradition to exist and subsist. And so on the one hand, I'll be talking about the work of the Bauhaus artist Laszlo Moholy-Nagy and the German Dadaist, kind of self-made Dadaist, Kurt Schwitters. And more broadly, I wanted to frame my discussion of their work within a theoretical claim that the avant-garde ushered in a change in 20th century art that wasn't simply an art historical change, but a kind of meta-historical reflection on the very possibility of art history, a change in those basic presuppositions of how we historicize art and how we write about art. So the move of Laszlo Moholy-Nagy encompasses a vast diversity of media, including painting, graphic art, photography, photograms, which are direct printing of objects on photographic paper, photomontage, sculptural assemblages, kinetic sculpture, light projection, and film, just to kind of lay out. He was a very restless multimedia artist. And in the increasing penetration of technology in the practice of art and design, and the immersion of experience in an environment that was technically shaped as what he called vision in motion, Moholy-Nagy discerned a mobilization of historical experience that unsettled the boundaries between past, present, and future, particularly as the various kinds of traces and signs of history pass through various stages of technical mediation. So he positioned his artistic work as a relay point in the present through which the future could reach back into the past and reconfigure it as a changeable repertoire of material traces that could be remediated technologically. And then I go on to talk about Kurt Schwitters, whose work analogously attacks the ordering of time that underlies tradition and offers alternative measures of time. So in his collages and writings, Schwitters invests apparent sequentiality with singular metrical differences. He explores illogical successions within sequences and illustrates the disruptive working of the unruly, desiring body on sequences, on that linear process. He also disrupts time through intermittence and unexpected recurrences, especially in his writings, and that's another thing about Schwitters' work really across the whole spectrum of different media. Lastly, he revises the idea of artistic consequence as it gets used, for instance, in narrative or in musical form. The idea of consequence is you have something happen here, and therefore it results in this way, and that can either be a musical harmony or a plot line that makes sense at the end, and that kind of consequence. Schwitters replaces this notion of consequence with an alternative that's determined not by sequence, but by relevance, and the metrics of relevance have multiple dimensions. So it allows him to put together material in a different way. So the basic theoretical idea was advanced by Peter Berger in his classic theory of the avant-garde already in 1974, the original German edition of that. Although it was relatively little noticed in the extensive debates that Berger's book set off, but I'm going to quote a key passage in which Berger claimed in so many words that despite the failure of the avant-garde to realize its utopian goal of transforming life through radicalized art, it did succeed in something. The more limited goal of destroying a certain conceptual basis of art history conceived as a coherent succession of styles. And we're familiar with these notions of high Renaissance style, Mannerism, Baroque, and so forth. And Berger was arguing that the avant-garde was a point where that very possibility of a style history of art gets disrupted by the artistic practice. So he writes, whether the break with tradition that the historical avant-garde movements brought about has not rendered irrelevant all talk about the historical level of artistic techniques practiced today is something to be carefully thought about. The availability and mastery over artistic techniques of past epochs owed to the avant-garde movements make it virtually impossible to determine a historical level of artistic procedures. Through the avant-garde movements, the historical succession of techniques and styles has been transformed into a simultaneity of the radically disparate. So rather than succession, a kind of horizontal dispersion of possibilities of inventing of art, and he concludes the consequences that no movement in the arts today can legitimately claim to be more historically advanced as art than any other. And of course, that's key to the idea of the avant-garde. The avant-garde is the vanguard. It's what comes ahead in history. He suggests that the avant-garde's work was basically to kind of explode that notion of history. An analogous argument would be advanced by the philosopher Arthur Danto in his 1997 book, After the End of Art, Contemporary Art and the Tale of History, in which Danto argues that the artworks of what he calls the age of manifestos, so the age of the avant-garde, were typically supported by a philosophical theory of art and a slanted reading of the history of art as the history of the discovery of a philosophical truth underlying art. And Danto argues basically that by the 1960s it had become clear that the truth of the historical present was that this notion of manifesto-driven art is philosophically untenable. That we're no longer in a period where we think that art carries some sort of essential truth about the moment of history or some sort of philosophical truth about human nature. Danto doesn't argue that the end of art in this sense means the end of artworks or artistic practice, but the kind of burden of historical philosophical truth carried by art, he suggests, has been actually undermined by the practice of art itself up to this point. So what Danto doesn't really emphasize, Berger actually strongly asserts, is that it's precisely the activity of the avant-gardes that brings art to this point of giving up its kind of essential nature, and that it must be in some way like this in order to be authentically modern or authentically contemporary. The proliferating strings of strong, exclusive, but conflictual claims that the avant-gardes put forward about why their particular movement was the essential age of art and their construction of art historical narratives to justify these claims leads instead to, in the latter half of the 20th century, to the recognition that this conflict is irresolvable. So you're never going to have a definitive victory of cubism or constructivism or futurism, and what that conflict itself actually reveals is that we have an irreparable kind of differentiation and no possibility of kind of definitively settling that. There's a very retrospective aspect to what both Dante and Berger do, and they suggest that it's only after the avant-garde moment is over, when they've already passed into history, does this kind of open-ended relativism of contemporary art become available. Berger reads this somewhat somberly, because he actually is very much at that point as a sort of ex-German student radical, he's very attached to the idea of a kind of revolutionary art. Danto, sees this as a kind of happy pluralism in which we can celebrate art, but we don't have to resolve these kinds of heavy questions. But both of them make the same assumption that this is a moment in which it's only after the avant-garde that we see this kind of development. And I just want to suggest here that within the very moment of the historical avant-garde, and I'll use Moyen-Age and Schwitters, is that there's already a kind of unsettling of this. And you can actually read backwards from this moment where this is being theoretically asserted to actually look at works like Moyen-Age's and Schwitters to see this kind of pluralization and differentiation and questioning of that narrative already in action in the midst of the avant-garde. So I'm going to begin with Moyen-Age. I've called this section Working Space and Time, Shaping. And I'll specifically be focusing on ideas that he had about photography, film, the modernization, the technologization of visual experience, and then also in a kind of more conceptual term, the implications of his thoughts about the mobilization of vision and technical reproduction for the historical transmittability of tradition. And to bring these two elements together, the idea of a mobilized perception of vision and motion, as he calls it, and the integral role of technology in this mobilization, I'd offer the following summary. Moyen-Age understands technically mobilized vision to be not only reshaping modern humanity's relation to space, but also through the analogous technical mobilizations of the traces of the material traces of past events and of the present, that it also is reshaping our relation to time and history. And just as Moyen-Age talks about a technical morphosis of space, we can also see in his work a technical remediation of tradition in ways that makes us imagine a technically reshaped relation to the past and to the present. Moyen-Age does at times affirm a kind of progress in the arts that's measured by the exploration of new media technologies that allow new forms of expression to come into being. But he also sees the specific operations of these technologies as leading to a kind of horizontal spread of new relations, interactions, and possibilities, such that any progressive narrative of development is called into question. So to give you a little bit of a sense of his work, I'd like to consider something that was in a film scenario that he presented actually twice, but the film was never realized. So what we have are these two kind of multimedia textual entities. It was called Dynamics of the Metropolis, so it was that fascination with the experience of the big city. And he first published it in Hungarian in the Avant-Garde journal Ma. Ma means today in Hungarian, so very much of the present. It was edited in exile in Vienna by the poet and artist Lajos Kossuth. And Moyen-Age subsequently published a different version in the German language in his book Malerei, Fotografie, Film, painting, photography, and film, in the Bauhaus book series in 1925. And just, you can see already very different kind of layout and treatment of the material. So I'll begin with the Hungarian version. And I first want to note that it appears in a special issue of Ma that's not dedicated to either film or photography, but to music and theater. It includes text on performance, including the futurists Filippo Tommaso Marinetti and Trampolini on futurist theater, Kurt Schwitters on his kind of version of Dadaist theater, the Märzbühne, the Russian artist Lizitsky's presentation of an electromechanical puppet version of the Russian futurist opera, Victory Over the Sun, which was accompanied by this set of portfolio illustrations by Lizitsky, an essay by the Soviet director and theorist Alexander Tyrov, an essay on the mechanization of music by the composer Stuckenschmidt, and other text and images that are related to a broad spectrum of avant-garde performance. Thus, while Moholy-Nagy's text is clearly labeled a film sketch, the context presents it as a performance work. And implicitly, the typography maps the letters and we look at the way that he's laid this out, that it maps the letters and the words and the symbols and the images on the page as a kind of virtual stage, so a sort of performance. And notably, he also makes reference to the circus, which was a kind of interesting, it was of interest to a wide range of avant-garde, because it was a popular, vulgar art form, lots of crazy things happening, clowns, colliding, animals, and so forth, and also things happening simultaneously. So it was very interesting for the German avant-garde. And Moholy-Nagy actually elaborates this in the German version. He adds girls, a ski acrobat, an animal trainer, and further details about the circular space that's not in the Hungarian version, but he's further elaborating the circus idea. So, as I noted, the German version recontextualizes the Hungarian text by placing it in the visual and technological media framework of painting, photography, and film. So from theater, music, performance to these visual media. And unlike the arrangement in the journal, so this is the journal. The journal is divided into 3 regular columns. The different elements create pushes and pulls across the diagonals, but the German version is vertically and horizontally gridded in an arrangement that's clearly influenced by kind of constructivist, much more clean design, and it creates the implication of spatialized zones in which events and objects are appearing in overlapping relations of simultaneity and phase transition. The German edition also incorporates photographic images which give it a more filmic look. In some places, even suggesting strips of film and film stills as an editor might view them on a light table. Its pages are less dense than the journal publication, which means that the film scenario takes up a full 14 pages of the book. And also turning the pages gives a kind of tactile impression of progressive movement, sequence, and the unfolding of experience, rather than this journal page, which is a big square journal. There's an idea of a kind of immersion in that space, rather than this kind of film flipbook kind of character of the German version. And in addition, the Hungarian version includes a set of explanatory notes, really footnotes, to help the reader's comprehension of the composition. In the German version, these are almost eliminated and are just incorporated in a few places into the text. So one of the most interesting variations between the 2 versions involves the opening sequence in which a series of linear forms compose themselves down this kind of film strip-like version. It's actually like a film animation of a metal construction that is being formed before the viewer's eyes. And this is a kind of self-reflexive allegory of filmmaking itself, in which the elemental pieces of a technology-saturated metropolitan space compose themselves into a piece of complex machinery that then extends the work of construction or mobilization. In the Hungarian version, the machine that's constructed is a steel crane, which Moholy-Nagy emphasizes is used for building houses as it moves up and down in circles. In the German version, instead, he offers a photograph instead of the hand-drawn sequence, implying the animation cells, and now his note indicates that the animated film is to compose a set of points and lines into a totality that then transforms into the photograph of the construction of a Zeppelin. And so it thus shifts the technological theme from that of machine construction to a technology that mobilizes, accelerates, and elevates human embodiment and perception. So we're getting, in some sense, kind of the Zeppelin view by the time that we're at this point in the text, and also moving at the speed of the airship. So the significance of this revision, and it's only 1 year apart, is that this constitutes an important point to underscore. And in both versions, he implies a kind of continuity between machine technologies in the larger environment and the media technologies of registration and reproduction. Both of them are expressions of technological modernization, as is found in the big city. But the revision imposes a shift of emphasis. The Hungarian version, emphasis falls on the artist as a constructor, as a kind of artist-engineer. And then the montage work of the film editor is one of creating new relations of connection. In the German version, the role of the artist is reconceived. Here, the overall emphasis falls on the technologies themselves, and particularly the technologies of movement, transportation, and therefore everything involved in mobilizing and kind of mixing perception. Reproductive media, and most important film, are now cast less as constructive in machinery and more as communication and transportation in virtual space. Moreover, we can say that the object of Moholy-Nagy's film script is no longer the machine itself, but the perceptual environment that includes the technological shaping of both external space and vision. So notably, this was the key message that the architectural historian Siegfried Gideon also emphasized in his influential book, Building in France. This is a page from Building in France, in which the weightless structures of modern architecture, facilitated by steel and steel-reinforced concrete materials, lift images from the city view and mobilize them into new patterns and constellations. And especially in the top picture, you can see the way in which the city space is framed through this iron grid of architecture. Architecture's solidity is dematerialized into mobile views and plays in light, shadow, and shifting form. Now, Moholy-Nagy provided the photo montage for the book's jacket, and in this photo montage, we've returned to that crane that was in the journal version, but here we have the use of a photographic negative that changed the meaning of this particular image. The implication now is that this mobile crane is seen as a kind of stop point on a dynamic trajectory, this crane moving around, and a particular distribution of negative and positive spaces and black and white shades on a gray scale. So despite its mechanical trajectory, its effect on perception is discontinuous, disparate, and differentiating. It's no longer a piece of construction machinery. The crane has become a moving apparatus for a dynamic fracturing and reassemblage of visual experience. It's become, and perhaps by a kind of explicit reference to a modern film studio, it's become a literal part of a kind of vast cinematic apparatus that it's also externally present in the industrial metropolis, of which the film studio is only a kind of limited microcosm. So the argument here is really that Moholy-Nagy is representing the metropolis itself as a kind of space of cinematic production, which no longer needs an explicit film because we all live in this film. We all live the kinds of montaged perception and visual experience that this technology facilitates. So Moholy-Nagy extends this notion of kind of what he calls the morphosis of space to the temporal dimension of history, somewhat less explicitly, but we can get it by remarking a couple of features of his work. First of all, he was fascinated with the new technical media associated with the registration and preservation of documentary material, including photography, film, and sound recording. And second, he explored various artistic techniques that broke down in the use of technical media the distinction between production, the original production of the image, and the reproduction of the image. And just to give you a sense of what that might mean concretely, he was very interested in utilizing film, photographic paper, what do you call it? Like nobody has it. Records, you know, sort of that. Where he was using various kinds of techniques to directly create images or inscriptions in the sound material, and to utilize that as a primary means of production, even though these would typically be ways of, you know, you would record sound and it would create the groups, or, you know, you would take a photograph and it would make the image. He was doing things like making a direct intervention into the photographic paper or scratching in different patterns. He even used the very early sound film where, there was no magnetic tape at that point, so he was actually utilizing that to create various sorts of figural patterns on the sound strip of the sound film in order to experiment with what we might think of as almost a kind of primordial electronic tape music. So that difference between production and reproduction was something that he was exploring. So, for instance, he gets the idea of having with phonographic recording a use of the phonograph to create innovations in sound production without new instruments and without an orchestra, but to actually directly create sound. And he basically had the idea that if we could master a vocabulary of this kind of production, we would have an unprecedented range of artistic possibilities for the use of sound. And you can hear this is a kind of development. We're talking about in the 1920s and very early 30s that he is theorizing this. It's not really until after World War II that you actually have this kind of technical capacity to do this with tape music, for instance. So it's a sort of visionary anticipation of some of the technological possibilities that he's just glimpsing in a more primitive sound recording technology. So I would suggest that he's already beginning to imagine these possibilities within photography, film, and sound recording that have only recently been sort of fully realized by various kinds of digital technologies like Photoshop, AI creation of deepfake image and voice recordings, with their very profoundly unsettling effects that such kinds of interventions into the documentary basis of the historical archive might entail. We know now that if you can basically create very convincing fake photographs where almost anything can be a photograph, the question of photographic evidence becomes a much more difficult one, or now recorded voice, or even cinematic production. So he also notes how technological registration and manipulation of traces can disrupt the basis on which the transmission of tradition rests. But for Moholy-Nagy, such remediation of the past is a largely optimistic prospect. He does not really sort of see this as just a means of Orwellian control or manipulation, but he actually sees this as the mobilization and dynamization that offers exciting new relations between historical material and current productions. So he's really seeing this as a way of opening up the historical tradition and the historical archive in new ways. And we might even say that the registration and preservation of documentary traces in a chronologically locatable way is the underlying principle of the historical archive. Moholy-Nagy unsettles the archive's indexing of historical trace to a definite moment in time. For its technical produced or reproduced form, it can be duplicated, reiterated, spliced and montaged with other material, or even be produced in the first place, unrelated to any prior historical event or reality. In the new archive that this technology promises, Mohoy-Nagy evokes an open-ended simultaneity of disparate historicizing relations, but only a few of which would be recognizable within any disciplinary sense of history as conventionally historical. So he's also broadening the definition of what might be legitimate historical connections between the material and a kind of experimental approach to history. So I'm going to segue now to Schwitte's somewhat more humorous than Mohoy-Nagy in a number of ways. And this section is called Merz was Schwitte's kind of personal name for his own practice of art, and it came from one of his early collages in which the German word Kommerz had lost the first part, and it's just a kind of cutout. And he used this for basically the whole range of his production, everything from his writing to his collages to even as a Merzbau, it was a kind of architectural construction where he made this out of a kind of continually growing collage of materials. So I start with a quote from Schwitte's, and I'm going to really concentrate here, especially on the presence of numbers and the way that he manipulates numbers. But he says, what does it mean to write poetry? 2 times 2 equals 4 is not yet a poem. So that's in 1919. So one of the most direct ways that Schwitte's engages with this question of metrics and the unruly, disruptive, and imaginative recreation of measure is with the direct incorporation of numbers into his works as compositional means. So we could see, for example, several of his collages that include a number of ways, that include numbers in ways that raise questions of what these numbers refer to, the quantity, order, and value that numbers would suggest. And this is also true not just of his visual works, but also his very sizable corpus of literary writings and theoretical writings, which include performance and concrete poems, as well as prose text, such as, for instance, the Merz poem 8, entitled The Onion from 1919, which references the numbered chapters of a table of content, or his 1922 allegory of art criticism, which is also designated like a kind of a medicine, a liver extract, Augusta Volta, which uses a 1 through 10 number sequence to designate its characters. So when you see these numbers here, these are the sequence of characters that are all appearing together, and he just refers to by these numbers. And it means that numbers have a regular typographical presence in the pages. Numbers, especially ordinal numbers and numbers as quantifiers that depend on ordinal sequences, pervade the work of Schwitte's. And so I want to consider how that is, and suggest in some way why. So as to the latter question, why the presence of numbers in Schwitte's work, the artist gives us an important clue in the 1926 text that's called Fantastic Thinking. And Schwitte's here distinguishes between mathematic logic and what he calls human logic, which is grounded in the shifting relationality of the pronouns. So here's what he says. We humans do not think 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 1, 1 and a half, 1 and a fourth, 1 and an eighth, 1 and a 16th, or 2, 3, 1, 4, 1, 5, 6. Rather, we think I, you, we, you, all. Schwitte suggests here that there's a mismatch between mathematics and human logics because human thinking is mediated through embodied representation, that is, it functions phenomenologically. if you want to mathematize an ever-changing human reality, Schwitter suggests, for example, in a formula like 1 equals infinity or 1 is not equal to 1, you will be writing nonsense, human nonsense. However, he continues, perhaps mathematics itself is nonsense because we can't think completely abstractly. Our thinking only makes sense insofar as it is supported by bodily representation. So this is a very explicitly phenomenological proposition he's making. He indicates his general concern in the name of human individuality and intersubjectivity to relativize mathematically rational orders, and also implicitly in various places the bureaucratic rationality that depends on assigning sequential and relational numbers on everything from case files to street trolleys, and the economy and tram tickets and so forth, which are some of the basic materials that he incorporates into collages. And this is rather starkly illustrated by a work that he called in his 1935 work, the eye drawing, the Ich-Zeichnung, which he did from exile in Norway, in which the blood-red letters of the first-person pronoun and the blue geometrical form emerge starkly from the brown number-filled background of ads and transportation tickets. In his 1919 watercolor, Aquarelle number 1, The Heart Goes from Sugar to Coffee, it contains the numbers 69 and 19. In the case of the 69, it might seem to refer to the geometrical angle of which it could be a label, and more generally to the compass settings evoked by the angles and circular figures in the middle of the watercolor. Yet the angle would be, contrary-wise, appear to be about 45 degrees rather than 69. I would suggest that the number 69, first of all, it has certain kinds of erotic connotations, which I won't spell out for you, but it may represent a numerical analog of Schwitter's palindrome and reversible analuma, probably his most famous work of writing, in which Schwitter's reminds us that AN in A reads the same backwards and forward. So the erotic theme hinted by the title, The Heart Goes from Sugar to Coffee, suggests as much. The 19 in this case doesn't refer, as it sometimes does in the case of the Merz pictures, to Schwitter's meticulous numbering of the works in series. So he has, Merz 251, Merz 252, and so forth. But rather it's an abbreviation of the date of its execution, along with the artist's abbreviated signature. It may be surmised that the work entitled by the Roman numeral 10x, my 191, may also self-reflexively refer to the date of its composition, 1919. There are also two Merz pictures from 1922 that bear the title Zahlen, numbers. This one and this one. So he's referring to the concrete presence of the number forms, signaling their lack of any clear reference or function, and in the latter case, in this case, the abstraction of what seem to be highly enlarged segments of number forms overlapping and interweaving with one another. So I'd like to dwell at a little bit greater length on one of the pictures entitled Picture with Light Center. And this is a good-sized picture, and I'm just going to sort of take us around a few of the details of this. So this picture is from 1919. It disposes several different numbers at different scales. So there are, for instance, the large black numbers, 2395. Let's see. 94. I'm sorry.
15, right?
Yes, sorry. 1395, which is upside down, and 94, as well as the 20p, 2050, Phoenique, most likely, and seats number 20. I'm having trouble actually seeing the screen, so I'm sorry if I'm kind of missing. Okay, sorry. This is number 2 in this advertisement. There's also the Zweite Raum, so this is probably a theater ticket, and the row and seat number. You can't read the row number, but you can read the seat number. In addition, there's a 3 that is printed on one of the collage postal stamps, and numbers that can only be inferred, but no longer read on other postal stamps. And there's also a very obscure and inverted, the reference of the days to the days of the months of the calendar, 31 days, and lastly, Schwitte's own dating of the work, 1919, along with his signature and initials. So we would be mistaken in this instance to construe the numbers in picture with light circle to be only kind of concrete material that he's just sort of moving around, since Schwitte's also mobilizes them as references to different conceptual, semiotic, and social ordering systems that pervade three-dimensional spaces, while at the same time allowing these various systems to interfere with one another on the two-dimensional plane of the Mex composition. So in one frame of reference, which is a purely pictorial formal one, the numbers conjure up structural elements of painting. As pictorial elements, they offer inflections of size, relative position on the canvas, distinctness or obscurity of their figure and contour, and layering to suggest in-frontness or behindness of objects as seen as points in space. If we compose these various aspects of the number images together coherently, we might produce the skeleton of a continuous three-dimensional perspectival space, as his use of numbers sometimes somewhat ironically alludes. They depend on an orderly metrical relationship on the canvas. But the point is that they fail to add up to a continuum. They interrupt and interfere with one another, always coming up short and amounting to too much. But going beyond the visual features of the numbers as structure and space implying, there are also ways in which the numbers allude to an open set of semantic fields and social functions, such as advertising, street numbering, the postal system, commodity exchange and money, the theater and or cinema, and the serial printing of newspapers, advertisements, and graphics, which obviously often have dates attached to them. The radial organization of this painting, which you see here, with its larger circular and light-colored forms concentrated at the center, may suggest the trajectories of movement and activity within a modern urban space. Or alternatively, we can see this as a kind of head-like shape, indicating a kind of eye, taking in various mobile fragments around it. So this reading would situate Schwitte's Metzbild within other representations of contemporary disorder or complexity, such as Georg Grotz's Metropolis from 1916 to 17, the work that we've already discussed, the Laszlo Moholy-Nagy's film script, or Zita Vertov's Man with a Movie Camera, which depended on a set of complex metrics applied to film editing. In Vertov's case, he had a kind of what he called an interval theory of film, where he would make almost mathematically calculated sequences to intercut and represent these kinds of rhythms and experiences mediated by technology. So Schwitte's offers us the disordered metropolitan space without the anxiety of Gross. He offers us the intervallic relation of urban dynamics like Moholy-Nagy and Vertov, but without their sort of technological rationalism and utopianism. Numbers function individually in Picture with Light Center as cool and sober markers of the modern city, but they're rendered disorderly by their being put together into interpenetrating, overlapping systems frames of reference, and functional fields. So I think in the interest of time, I'm just going to end with one text from Schwitte's that I'll read you a quote from, and it suggests kind of the way in which I'm putting this material together with Moholy-Nagy. And this is called, it's a text from 1925. It's called How One Enters a Cinema for Free. And we can see that Schwitt is working analogously, summed up in a kind of parable-like way, the irrationality that arises at the interface between internally rational subsystems of social rules and regulations. In this short text, Schwitt offers a parody of a communistic utopia in which commodity relations will have been suspended. He plays an absurd game with time and space metrics that suggest the broader metrical irrationality that pertains in the wider domains of social space in the capitalist city. So this is the text, and I will just let this stand as the conclusion of this. So he writes, in Prague, entrance is Vschod and exit is Vyschod. The whole difference is only one short I. That gave me an occasion to think, and I thought about the concept entrance and exit. And with success, the essential is always the direction of the head. At the entrance, it points inward. At the exit, outward. Good. I asked the doorman of a large cinema in Berlin whether in entering a cinema there is a prescribed speed. He believed that there existed no regulation about that. Good. So, history can also be negative. Accordingly, one must enter not the entrance, but the exit of the cinema, if one wants to enter for free. You position yourself facing out, with the other lovely part of your body, of course, facing in, and exist with negative speed. No one can thus require anything of you because you are using the exit in the allowed manner. Thus, everyone enters the cinema without paying anything. Good. Now you're standing in the movie house. You aren't permitted to remain standing. The police won't allow it. For the use of a seat, the cinema demands a charge. There only remains to you a choice. Either you must take a place and pay, or you have to go out again. So that's the tech. He's imagining this kind of reversal of time through a negative speed, which he relates to a negative history. So he was able to rewind history by backing into the exit of a cinema, and therefore suspending the need to pay, with this other problem of, okay, you're in the cinema, now you can't sit until you pay. So your only choice is to go out. This is an instance of the way in which he is putting together these various kinds of systems of rules to basically suggest their internal contradictoriness. But I think what I also, besides the sort of absurdist humor in this, we see the way in which he is playing with the idea that speed, direction, various ways of manipulating may allow a different kind of trajectory to experience that he ultimately, explicitly in this text, relates to possibilities of thinking about and even perhaps writing history in a different way. So I'll pause there.
Thank you. Thank you. Well. Any questions?
Right, I'm being volunteered to go first. It's all right. So I want to ask a question from a slightly anthropological perspective. I often find cultures tend to employ, whether passively or actively, a shared art style or art that reflects the society's values, which acts as a sort of a non-verbal language that helps to bind the community together. In essence, the argument is a soul society, and art reflects it. In contrast, the Avant-Garde seems less concerned with this, and sort of continuous avant-garde movements or actions that suggest either a continued disruption in society's culture and its shared language, or perhaps indicating a more reflective stance on it. So from this perspective, would you say that this artistic style tends to be more actively engaging with a potential breakdown in the values of society, or is it just reflecting changes in society?
Well, I mean, the idea of the avant-garde and the idea of motivating the avant-garde is that there's a kind of, let's say, however you define it, a historical background. It might be defined as the existing tradition or previous artistic styles and so forth. And the ideas of being in advance of them. In fact, it's a military metaphor that the kind of small, lightly armed infantry that goes ahead of the main army. So there is some sort of there's an activistic aspect of that, and there is an aggressive aspect of that in many cases. That's often been thought of in just very negative terms, just that they reject the tradition. And one of the things that is really motivating this work, and which kind of is part of the larger project, is to think about, yes, I mean, that's a key aspect of the avant-garde, but to your point about are they merely reflecting or are they seeking to shape that, it's to think about the ways in which they are actually generating a set of conceptual alternatives to the history that they understand themselves to be receiving. And some of this work, some of the avant-garde work and the artistic work is quite, absurd and crazy in various sorts of ways. But I think that there's a serious underpinning of this, of a diagnosis and active intervention into alternative ways of constructing a historical narrative or notions of political agency or understandings of the interpenetration of human action and technology that gives this, for me, a more, not humorous, but a more serious underpinning, epistemically more serious underpinning. So I'm really, I'm motivated by trying to move into their thought world in this key moment in the 1920s and 30s, and to really try to understand, yes, they are responding to certain kinds of historical developments that go well beyond the arts, but through the arts, they're utilizing that as a unique prism to think those larger questions, and to some extent, to engage in various kinds of forms of organization, or at least concepts of organization that that we should take seriously, and that we can also see certain kinds of later after echoes in more active forms, later today.
And kind of a commentary challenging question. You start your conference speaking about the knowledge of target here related with praise. Can we use the avant-garde concept for the prehistoric artistic practice in prehistory? In fact, they were very strict rules regarding, for example, rock art, and then at certain point they challenge and they shifted the meaning, shifted the technologies, the means of expression. Can we use these avant-garde concepts thinking in prehistoric artists?
Actually, there is, like Picasso was using a lot of rock art to explain his job. Like the Mademoiselle, the one is one of the most famous paintings of him, but he used to compare this with I don't know, like Altamira, this kind of rock art. He used to
Apparently,
compare.
he was the one that said that after Altamira everything is decadence.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, so
I agree.
there are a lot of artists.
So there's no question that the discovery and the presentation of prehistory was an influence on the art. But I think your question is a more challenging one, which is, in what way does the reflection back offer at least certain kinds of epistemic possibilities for thinking or for communicating differently about this work. And I wouldn't want to overclaim to say that they're making a direct contribution to science in the specific form of these artistic works. But I do think that some of the thinking that they did has really affected our thinking about what constitutes a historical archive. Some of the thinking about the ways in which the remotivation of materials in new contexts and with new sorts of juxtaposition reveals new elements of these works. So the idea of recontextualization or juxtaposition is a fundamental avant-garde technique, and it has, I think, it has a certain scientific suspiciousness because, mere analogical thinking or mere, sort of fantastic thinking is not, not scientifically useful. But I think that there's a range where we no longer necessarily believe in the canons of positivism as the only way of getting valid interpretive material out of, in a kind of scientific frame. There are also interesting instances of engagements with the ethnographic material on the part of people who start out as basically artists and literary figures and become serious ethnographers or scholars of various kinds of what they start to think of as primitivism and reject that concept and become serious scholars of that. And I do think that those ways of entering into that material actually have impacted, especially anthropology. There's an American historian of anthropology, James Clifford, who has a very nice essay on ethnographic, what he calls ethnographic surrealism. And he's particularly focusing on the group around Georges Bataille and Michel Riis, who goes on the various African ethnographic and the ways in which the relativizing of European culture and European knowledge vis-a-vis the indigenous materials that they're reflecting, I think was really one of the hinge points in which he was thinking. And that's very much something that comes from that side out of the avant-garde.
In prehistoric art studies, there's a big debate that no one like very much regarding the word art. In your opinion, do you think that whatever is the concept of art to you could be applied for what we call prehistoric art?
That's a difficult question. So one thing that I'll say is that the avant-garde represented very much an attack on a particular notion of art, and one that was confined in various ways in its social function, in its spaces, and so forth. So they are contributing to an opening of that concept to media, to relations to political and popular technological contexts, and so forth. There's no sense do I see that concept of art as related, as equal in some sense to what the practices that have been described as prehistoric art. But I do think that, again, it's a lens on which it's possible to look and not see that solely in kind of formal, painterly terms or sculptural terms, but to really see a broader kind of context of practices in which the avant-garde was aiming at in their artistic practice, and that gives a certain lens from which to read the past. I don't know whether to describe this kind of, there's certainly a production that goes beyond functionalism. And so there is an aesthetic, sensual, sacred, a variety of kinds of ways in which, one might think of what gets narrowed into a concept of art as simply the aesthetic. But I think the avant-garde is in some ways more in tune with that breadth of possibilities that may have existed in the producers of Paleolithic or Neolithic art than they were necessarily to the painting academies of the 19th century. What do you think?
Yeah, it's one of those debates that we could stay here for a month talking about this, because first I think should I have asked first, like, if you have to describe what art is for you in one sentence, what would it be, and then can we apply that what we call prehistoric art? I think there are many things that can classify what is prehistoric art. What are the functions, social, territorials, communication, whatever. I think there are many things that can be included. The aesthetic point of view is also there, of course, in many types of rock art. But I was curious to know exactly the opinion of somebody from avant-garde area, because this is a debate that actually is never ending. The concept of art, can we use that concept to prehistoric art? Because the word is there, prehistoric art. But then, there are so many things that we could actually go further, but it goes for what is art? What is considered art?
Mm-hmm.
Does it change over time? Does it change according to societies? What is art? That's, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I'm on the one hand have a very expansive and open-ended notion. I mean, in this sense, I kind of take a Wittgensteinian view that there's a whole number of different uses of art. And I'm not so familiar with with the question of prehistoric art. I know a little bit more in terms of basically, especially African art, where that's utilized as a concept to map it into a certain kind of museum and collecting process. And it's also there's a value element of this where the shift from ethnographic artifact to art work it's a crucial recoding of this, often the same artifact, including and actually the whole museum institution, where things that have previously been thought of as merely documentary evidence or artifactual evidence now become artworks. I have seen in relation to prehistoric art, there is a certain kind of formalist, modernist display of things like Frobenius's tracings of works, and they're displayed really as work, as if you were presenting works of Picasso. They're in a kind of white cube museum space. There's very little explanatory information. You're meant as a modern Parisian or a modern New Yorker to contemplate those as formalist works of art akin to modern works of art. That's clearly a scientific abuse. And in that sense, I wouldn't want to talk about them as art. But I think in this more expanded view, there are ways of thinking about the affinities of a large, expansive, multifunctional view of art and those possibilities as existing 10,000, 15,000 years ago.
Go ahead.
I wanted to add something. This is a discussion that is also open from the avant-garde or this kind of art of the 20th century, because it's like they have the same question, like is this art or it's a kind of like taking Hegel, a philosopher that say that art will arrive to be like a philosophy because it's an expression of a thought and it's an expression of community, society problem and different things. That is actually what happened with futurism, cubism and this kind of movement. So it's something that is already in all the kind of arts. Like it's between us for the prehistory and it's between the people that study other kind of art. So it's the definition of what is art. It's always really, I don't know how to say, but it's
subjective.
yeah, and I think it's really connected with the societies, with the communities, with the different time in which art is made. I think this is it's very special. But it's something that
Will you say something, Louise, and then I will make a comment if I may.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead. So, okay, then we should ask a question. What was that the people that pay, for example, paintings in Lascaux and Altamira, what was that for them? Was it art? Was it something else? And I'm saying this because the other day I was reading again an article by Holger Frey, which is a pioneer in acoustics, and it said, regarding acoustics, to have the right answers, we should ask the right questions. And that's clever, because sometimes if you ask questions to ourselves and to questions, sometimes we have kind of input from the same questions. So we should ask what the people from the Paleolithic and Neolithic think about their creations. And of course this is a difficult answer and a difficult question, but in order to make interpretation we should have a methodology. And which is not easy, but also to quote Ian Order, interpretation is a never-ending process of making sense. And such as Sarah said very well, this subject of rock art is real art is a never-ending. It will never end, because you will have dozens and dozens and dozens of different opinions. It will never end.
Last discussion, we include also the linting tools. Linting tools that in fact are art because they were never used and they are just to be beautiful and exposing the cake. So for this discussion we will continue. That's all.
If I may say something, taking what Fernando just said, I think there are questions we cannot ask. Like, what did they think about it?
That's difficult.
It's impossible. They're dead, so the only way to really know is to make an interview. What we can try to understand is issues of context. So what Hugo said, for example. Because what you call art, people will disagree also about art. Is graffiti art or not, for example, and there will be different opinions. I don't think that's the most important. The most important would be something that we can answer, is how a certain kind of representations emerge and within which context. Now, one interesting thing, for example, in your presentation here, okay, all these movements in the beginning of the century goes in line with a very progressive notion of history, right? So, building, so they are creating things that point to a future, which is a utopian future. And so they're no longer interested in, not even in symbolic landscape interpretations of whatever. They're looking at something that doesn't exist yet. So they're interested in social movements, they're interested in stuff like that. We could say hunter-gatherers were interested in animals, were interested in play. Okay. Was this art or not? Well, they were not stupid, for sure. So they knew that the bisons in the walls were not real bisons. Then the rest is beliefs, and you can believe in many things, and some might. But one thing that in this case makes me think is this. We're talking about people that's, in some cases, I didn't do these artists but Ziegler, for example, was very politically engaged, Mayakovsky, like people like that. But the interest of some of them, some of these artists on prehistoric art, is in a sense the notion of engaging with societies that they perceive intellectually as being earlier stages of evolution. Nevertheless, they assign to that art the same status of what they are today. And that's a bit of a kind of contradiction. I would say
It's not so much of a contradiction because basically there is it may be a rhetorical gesture, but there's a polemical gesture of saying these guys, who make these works in the cave are more our neighbor than these guys of the late 19th century who are in our museums. So there is a sort of gesture in that direction to say there's a much vaster range of human creativity than what has been given us by this narrow slice of art practice.
Bray that you mentioned is an interesting case. Bray was, although he was very conservative, he was also very interested in contemporary art of his time. And for example, when he makes he was a painter, a very skilled painter, and he improved the quality of the painting. So his representations of the Paleolithic art are very beautiful. They're Paleolithic art style, but they are not the drawings of Cyrus, because they're a little bit creative, improved, which is a very artistic approach. It's even a tribute. You add, you didn't see the conflict. But if we take a different thing and we look at prehistoric art, I would say that there are moments in prehistoric art where everything seems disorganized. And for example, Paleolithic art in general, although there are differences, is very organized. So you understand, you don't know what was their meaning, but you understand there's a strong dimension of narrative. And then you also understand, and tomorrow you can see that a little bit, but in Koa it's very clear. There's a strong focus on performative things. And that was interesting what you said about stage theater and so on, because in prehistoric art there are moments when this is very clear. It is discussed about the core, but it's more evident in all Oceanic art. In Oceanic art there's a lot of stuff. Now using ethnographic examples from Australia, for example, more important than the art itself is the act of doing art during the ritual performance where you dance, you sing, you drink, and you also paint. And there was an interesting experience in Serra da Cafinamar when Guidon brought some Aborigines from Australia to see the paintings of Capivara. And they were walking in the area and suddenly they stopped. They had been seeing different sites, and then they stopped in a specific place and they started dancing and singing and so on, and so all the archaeologists were very happy. now we have the key. So when the guys ended this thing, they asked, so you were impacted by this art, and so what does it tell you? And they said, the art. No, it's the place. So it was for them something different. And in relation of these prehistoric societies to landscape, in a sense, is probably in many cases very different from ours. Who mentioned the artifacts and lean modeling was the name for the person I wanted to tell you yesterday that work on the aesthetics. There's an emergence of an aesthetic sense over a million years ago with indexes and so on. Now, for a long time I thought you cannot call this art, but I was in a sense convinced by people like Juan Vicente Garcia and so on. Art doesn't necessarily work exactly the same time all the ones, but artists are combining an anticipation perspective, even when they are doing narratives and so on. It's always this focus on something for the future, and also mastering skill techniques. And this is what you find in Lascaux, in Altamira. So in that sense, it's art, but it's not the brain of our art.
Two other things I'll add. I mean, one is we're continually rereading this question of what is art through current conceptions of art. And one of the suggestions is the avant-garde really does represent a significant change in that, so it allows a certain kind of rereading. The other is, with respect to this question of what were they thinking, of course, we don't have any psychological access, and at least, in the case of the prehistoric art, obviously, no written textual accounts in a way that we do from Kurzschwitters, and we have, something more of the immediate access. We know what a Berlin movie house would look like and a ticket, what that would refer to. Nevertheless, I don't see it as fundamentally different. We don't have some sort of unique psychological access to what was Kurzschwitter's thinking when he was making the work. And it's the same work of basically paying attention to details, relations, to get some sort of notion of an intention that is not psychological, but is actually engaged in practice and in production. And it's obviously something that we have to infer and we have to interpret, but it's the intention that is embedded and embodied in an artifact, whether that's a work of collage or whether it's a set of inscriptions, on a rock face, that I don't see the problem as fundamentally different. It's a different artifact and a different level of access to the context.
I agree with you.
And in fact, actually, in our conversation, you were talking about a kind of increasing understanding of the relation between different works as, possibly opening the perception of new patterns and ways of understanding the meaning of particular instances. And I think, again, we study the corpus of an artist or a set of works in a movement in order to do something analogous. I think it's very difficult to look at a single Kurzschwitter's collage, that has various sorts of relatively disordered things that he may have just had that ticket in his pocket, and it doesn't mean anything more to him psychologically, but in the context of the work and in the oeuvre, it takes on those intentions.
Anyone else? No? Thank you very much. That was So we call it off for today. We will have more tomorrow.
Yeah.